The House of Windsor loves an impossible love. Some members have fallen in love platonic and have been able to do anything or almost anything to live out their fairy tale. He was the first, and in her own words, only love of Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom. And it was a very difficult love, but not impossible. She managed to marry him, and he stood by her side until death separated them 74 years later. Of course, he enjoyed all the luxuries of being the husband of the Queen of the United Kingdom. But on the other hand, it was not easy at all, since he had been born into European royalty, but was poor. His family was totally broken and he had to flee his country, Greece, in order not to face an almost certain death. So, from a young age, he wandered around Europe in relatives' homes and had no home to call his own, let alone a palace. In the English monarchy where money and position are everything, he had to earn respect, even though he was the husband of the most powerful woman in the country. He faced a lot of mistrust, humiliation and contempt. Today I will tell you the incredible story of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. From the moment his wife ascended the throne, he had to live in her shadow and spent his whole life walking 2 steps behind her. Philip's story does not begin in London, but on the island of Corfu in Greece. He was born on the dining room table on June 10, 1921. He was the 5th child and only boy of Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark and Princess Alice of Battenberg. He had 4 older sisters: Margareth, Theodora, Cecilia, and Sofia. His father Andrew was the son of King George I of Greece, and just as Philip was born, a military coup dethroned the Greek monarchy and his father was arrested on charges of treason by a military tribunal. Prince Andrew was forgiven his life in exchange for him leaving Greece forever. He was a distant relative of the King of England who sent a ship of the British Armada to rescue the entire family from Greece in 1922. Philip was only 1 year old and they took him off the island of Corfu in a box of oranges, an unnoble cradle for a European prince. The family began their exile by settling in Paris. They had no money and began living off the charity of wealthier relatives and friends. His uncle George and his wife Princess Maria Bonaparte gave them a house in Paris, where they lived for 7 years. It was an extremely difficult period for the family because they had almost no money. Her father published a book of his memoirs that was a total failure of sales. Her mother, Princess Alicia, was deaf from birth, but she was a strong woman who did not remain sympathetic to this disability, developed the ability to read lips and learned several languages. At that time, she worked in a store selling Greek products. However, she developed a religious fervor, going so far as to say that she saw Jesus and talked to him. Her family became concerned and sent her to the doctor and she was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia in the early 1930s and was forced to be committed to a psychiatric institution. Philip was still a child and we can imagine the impact this had on his life. For 5 years he did not see his mother and did not receive any letters from her. His father immersed himself in alcohol and women and went to live in an apartment in Monte Carlo, and in that same period between 1930 and 1931 all his sisters married German princes. Philip was literally left alone. He went from palace to palace, in the residences of relatives, and eventually ended up in the house of his mother's brother in England. In 1933, he was sent to a private school in Salem, Germany, where he studied for free as the school was owned by the family of his brother-in-law, Berthold of Baden. With the rise of Nazism in Germany, the founder of this school, Kurt Hahn, was Jewish and had to flee from persecution and founded the Gordonstone School in Scotland. He had a great influence on Philip's life and after 2 years studying in Germany, Philip was sent to Scotland to study at Gordonstone. In 1937 his sister Cecilia, her husband Jorge Donato from Hesse-Darmstadt, their 2 small children and his mother-in-law died in a plane crash in Ostend. This horrible event affected him deeply. He was 16 years old and attended the funeral in Darmstadt. While he was at Gordonstone, he was not visited by any relatives. It was a progressive but very strict school, which subjected the students to harsh physical and mental conditions. Philip simply adapted to the regime of the school like a fish in water. He was very energetic and used all this energy to overcome physical challenges and became a remarkable athlete, an excellent student, and a tough guy. He was captain of the field hockey team and the cricket team, and also a sports instructor. In 1938 another tragedy happened in Philip's life. His uncle and tutor Jorge died of cancer. Again, at the age of 17, Philip felt helpless, but this time his grandmother had the good idea of suggesting his other uncle, Louis Mountbatten, to take over the young man's care. Louis Mountbatten was a unique character, irreverent and free-spirited. He was married to a British millionaire, Edwina Ashley. In addition, he was a prominent kingdom officer, a naval captain who was involved in the construction of HMS Kelly, a modern warship, of which he was appointed commander in 1939. To say that Philip was fascinated by his new tutor is an understatement. The teenager quickly developed a passion for the Navy and in 1939 entered the Darkwood Royal Naval College, where he excelled, graduating the following year as the best cadet in his course. He was a great athlete and very competitive. His uncle was very proud and quickly became attached to the boy, caring and advising him, writing in his diary. While he is studying to enter the Navy, Philip comes home for lunch every day. He is smart and funny and I am already loving this boy. It is very likely that Philip saw in Mountbatten the father figure he never had. That was the relationship the two had until the end. Reports from the time indicate that the idea of Philip marrying Elizabeth first arose in Louis Mountbatten's head. And in 1939 when King George VI, his wife and their 2 daughters took a tour of Dartmouth, a prestigious naval academy, which trains the brightest cadets, Mountbatten himself put Philip to escort and serve as a guide for the girls. True or not, the plan worked. Elizabeth was 13 years old and was enchanted by that 18-year-old naval cadet, athletic and full of energy. He looked like a movie star. They were distant cousins and had certainly seen each other before. But it was on this occasion that she, in her own words, fell in love with him. And they began a series of correspondences over the following years. However, the princess was only 13 years old, and the world was preparing for war. During World War II, Philip served bravely as an officer in the British Navy on various Indian, Pacific and Mediterranean ships. The prince was very competent, brave, and showed serenity in times of crisis. On several occasions he saved others. Meanwhile his brothers-in-law were on the opposite side of the conflict. At the age of 21, he became one of the youngest officers with the rank of lieutenant commander in the British Army. During the invasion of Sicily, his idea was instrumental in fooling the German bombers and saving the ship of which he was second in the chain of command. With the end of the war, he wanted to continue escorting posts in the British Navy, and began to enjoy life, going out with his friends, to balls and parties. He was a flirt, and a heartbreaker. However, there was a heart that still hadn't forgotten about him. Elizabeth, who was now 18 and also had a huge list of suitors. She ignored them all, and her friendship with Philip turned into a courtship, which neither her parents nor the government approved of. Despite having bravely served his country during the war, he had no British nationality, and not even a last name, as he had always been confirmed by being called Philip of Greece. And that was the least of his problems. Queen Elizabeth Bowes-Lyons did not consider him suitable for her daughter. She wanted her daughter to marry a good English aristocrat from her surroundings, a duke or earl, who was well known and had a fortune. This was what was expected of the future Queen of England. Philip was considered to be without a future, an exiled prince without money. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, was suspicious of him, since all his brothers-in-law had fought on the German side. Besides, his father was a good-for-nothing, and his mother was mad, surely not the profile of the future Queen's mother-in-law they were looking for. They also disliked her uncle and tutor Mountbatten, they considered him rather liberal. And to top it all off, there was also talk that Philip was very sincere, had no tongue in cheek, had a temper, not to mention his way of expressing himself openly. He spoke his mind, whether it was politically correct or not. They said flatly that he would not be a good husband for her. But Elizabeth was beyond determined, in love, and wanted Philip to be her husband. She had been trying for a long time to convince her mother and the others to give in. But she knew that the decision would come from her father George VI, who felt a certain sympathy and admiration for Philip, for his efforts and hardworking and disciplined character acquired in the navy. Thus, the king was left in a difficult situation, having to decide between the two women he loved most in life, his wife or his daughter. However, we all know what the monarch's decision was. Philip acted quickly, gave up all Greek titles, converted to Anglicanism, applied for British nationality, and adopted his uncle Mountbatten's surname. After all this, the appointment was announced to the public on July 10, 1947. This angered many English nobles and aristocrats who considered that Philip was not even worthy to enter Buckingham Palace through the front door. They were married on November 20, 1947 in Westminster Abbey. Shortly before the wedding, the king granted him the title of Duke of Edinburgh. Of the groom's family, only his mother and uncle were present. His dear sisters and his Nazi brothers-in-law were not invited. Philip was beaming with happiness. He had finally triumphed. Those difficult and complicated years were behind him. He was now married to the most coveted and famous woman in the world. What could go wrong? He didn't know that his troubles had just begun. But first he had lived a brief period of peace and harmony at his wife's side, perfectly reconciling his work in the navy, which he loved, and the royal engagements he had to attend alongside the princess, whom he loved very much. He quickly realized that he couldn't stand the press all over him, expecting him to say something that would make the front page news the next day. He was assigned to the British Protectorate of Malta as an officer in the Royal Navy. That surely was the happiest time of his life. Philip was not a tender man. He was very demanding and inflexible. He was a hard and authoritarian leader. His men feared him. At the same time, they professed great respect and admiration for him. He was a born leader. He commanded a ship in Malta, and his wife accompanied him, and was delighted to see her husband excelling more and more in his career. She felt free. She went out shopping and drove her own car. Life was perfect for both of them. At that time, before she took the throne, they led a much more traditional life, and Philip was proud to work and support his family that began to grow in 1948 with the birth of their first child, Prince Charles and Princess Anne, who came into the world in 1950. It is very likely that the couple thought that they would have a good 10 or 12 years, at least, to enjoy family life without thinking about the succession to the throne. But in early 1952, they had to go on a long trip through Africa, Australia and New Zealand representing the British Crown. Since his father was not very well and had to recover from an operation. And shortly after, on February 6, 1952, the world was surprised that King George VI died so prematurely at the age of 56. He was found in the morning by his aide-de-camp dead of a heart attack. Philip and Elizabeth were in Kenya at the time and received the news with great amazement. Not only because of the loss of the king, on that day Philip had lost more than his father-in-law, he lost his entire brilliant career and the life he had built with his wife. A new character was also born, Queen Elizabeth II. Even before he set foot on English soil on the return trip, Philip stayed behind as the new queen stepped off the plane. That set the tone for the couple's new public life. Philip would always walk 2 steps behind the queen for the rest of his life. The wife of a king becomes queen, but the husband of a queen by right cannot become king, because according to the current rules, the king would have authority over her. Philip started a new life there, leaving his brilliant career behind to follow his wife, the new Queen of the United Kingdom. He already knew that things would get a bit complicated, however, underestimated British traditions and those who fiercely fought against his marriage to Queen Elizabeth, including the Prime Minister. The time had come to put the little prince in his place. For the coronation of the Queen, Philip wanted to organize the event and bring a bit of modernity to the event. However, both Winston Churchill and the Queen Mother were against it, and even though he faced all sorts of roadblocks and obstacles, he managed to get the event televised. The humiliations had just begun. One example was the day he accompanied Elizabeth to the opening of the United Kingdom's Parliament, discovering that the throne assigned to the consort that was next to the Queen's throne had been replaced by a simple chair. A message well given by the archaic and rancorous court that said in no uncertain terms that he no longer had any decision-making power, he was simply the Queen's husband and his opinion did not count. And when the question arose as to what the surname of his children would be, the surname Windsor was chosen. For Philip, the most important thing was that his children should have his surname, Mountbatten, since he was the father and the children had to bear his surname as tradition dictated. However, he ran into a wall, as the Queen Mother, Queen Mary of Teck, the Prime Minister and the government were not in agreement. Mary of Teck made it very clear that no matter who the father of the children was, they would be named Windsor. The house was created during the First World War and that surname should last forever. That was probably the worst humiliation he had to go through. He was really upset, furious, going so far as to say that he was nothing but a damned amoeba, and that he was the only man in the United Kingdom who could not give his own last name to his children. For a manly, old-fashioned man like Philip, that situation was really painful, which was making the Duke more and more resentful. The humiliations continued over the years. Every time he tried or gave an idea to modernize the monarchy, even minimally, he received a no as an answer. Naturally, it was a difficult situation for his wife, who was the Queen and had many concerns, and to impose her position as the new Queen, having a disgruntled and frustrated husband by her side. He was given a lot of absurd and purely symbolic titles. But this only affirmed his secondary role more and more. We don't know if it was directly related to his frustration or bruised ego, but what is certain is that Philip suddenly began to be in the news for his outings with friends, parties, drinking, and it was rumored that he even had lovers. And there were already rumors that the royal marriage was going through a crisis. He gathered 5 of his best friends and undertook a long trip around the world on the royal yacht, which took about 6 months. This trip further increased rumors of a crisis in the Queen's marriage, and she quickly acted to silence any gossip or evidence. After this estrangement from the Duke, the Queen felt the need to support her husband and give him more prominence, and things changed when Philip returned to the palace. She granted him the royal title of Prince of the United Kingdom, which did not confer on him the status of a monarch, but greatly improved his position at court, forcing other noblemen to show him more respect. Another thing, perhaps the most important to him, was that she allowed his children to have his surname Mountbatten. From that moment on, the surname Mountbatten Windsor would apply to all descendants of the couple, without the royal titles. Since those individuals with royal titles do not use the surname. These concessions that the Queen made to her husband undoubtedly brought the couple calm and peace of mind. They decided to start a second family. Prince Andrew was born in 1960, and in 1964 the couple's last child, Prince Edward, was born. It seemed that at last Prince Philip had found his place and felt comfortable in it. In the early 1960s, he, who had always been especially interested in the cause of environmental preservation, took an active part in founding the WWF, Worldwide Fund for Nature, and was president of the foundation in the UK for 20 years. Another highlight that Philip founded was the Duke of Edinburgh Award, focused on sports and physical education. It now operates in more than 50 countries. Philip took great care of these organizations. However, he did not stand out as an exemplary father. He adored his only girl, but did not give special attention to his other children, and the relationship he had with his son Charles could not be more strained and distant. He always tried to strengthen the relationship with Charles in his own way, but Charles, had a much more sensitive and shy character, completely opposite to his father. Philip could not understand this, and thought that giving Charles the same extreme education he received would strengthen his son, but it did not work, and this created a huge void between the two. On August 27, 1979, the two came together to mourn the tragic death of Louis Mountbatten, Philip's uncle and who also had a close relationship with Charles. Louis died while on vacation at his summer estate in Ireland from the explosion of a bomb, implanted in his boat. The IRA admitted that it was responsible for the bombing. On the 25th anniversary of the Queen's coronation, Philip and Elizabeth became grandparents for the first time. Philip may not have been an exemplary father, however, all his grandchildren agree that he was the most loving and best grandfather in the world. In August 1997, when Princess Diana died in a car accident in Paris, Philip was at that moment with his wife and grandchildren, the children of Charles and Diana, at Balmoral Castle. It was he who informed the boys of their mother's death. The Duke of Edinburgh attended her funeral by walking with his grandsons William and Harry in the procession behind Lady Di's coffin. Mohammed Al-Fayed publicly accused him of orchestrating the car accident that claimed the lives of his son and Diana. However, the investigation found no evidence of conspiracy, and everything was considered a tragic accident. This was possibly at one of the lowest points in the popularity of the British monarchy. Philip was honored by the Speaker of the House of Commons in 2002 during Elizabeth's Golden Jubilee celebrations for his role in supporting the Queen. In 2009 he achieved the status of the longest reigning consort in British history, and is also the longest serving man in the royal family. On June 4, 2012, in the midst of his wife's Diamond Jubilee celebrations, he fell ill and went into hospital for a bladder infection. He was discharged a few days later. The infection returned in August while at Balmoral Castle and Philip was hospitalized for 5 days as a precaution. Almost a year later he was admitted to London for surgery on his abdomen, spending 11 days in hospital. On May 4, 2017, Buckingham Palace announced that the Duke of Edinburgh would step down from his public duties from September. In August he attended the Royal Marines Parade at Buckingham Palace, thus making the last of his thousands of public appearances before retiring at the age of 96. On January 17, 2019, the Duke of Edinburgh was in an accident while driving a car that collided with another car. The Duke did not suffer any injuries, but came out of this accident shaken and in shock. The occupants of the other car were 2 women and a 9-month-old baby. The baby suffered only minor injuries, but the driver broke her wrist, and the other occupant cut her knee. This accident has activated a debate about elderly people driving cars in the UK. A few days after the accident, the Duke surrendered his driver's license. On February 16, 2021, at the age of 99, about 5 months before his 100th birthday, he was hospitalized to treat an infection. On March 1, he was transferred to another hospital to take care of a heart condition, and on March 4, Buckingham Palace announced that he had required surgery. Days later, he was again transferred to the Edward VII Hospital, where he was discharged on March 16, 2021, 28 days after admission. Philip passed away peacefully on the morning of April 9, 2021 at Windsor Castle. He was 99 years old. The Duke of Edinburgh went down in history as a highly respected figure in the United Kingdom for having given up a brilliant military career for a life of service to the crown that lasted nearly 70 years. He stood up to a deeply traditional court, reforming the palace, harnessing the growing power of television to project and outshine the monarchy. Since the day of Queen Elizabeth's coronation in 1952, the Duke of Edinburgh has attended 22,219 individual engagements, made 5,496 speeches, and made 637 official trips abroad. During his lifetime, he was a member of some 800 educational and sporting organizations. He was buried in St. George's Chapel, which is located in Windsor Castle as per his wishes. And this was the only public act, since 1952 when she became queen, in which Philip and Elizabeth were together, and he could not accompany her a few steps back. Now, she would have to continue alone,